Morning, everyone. I'm John Casper with the Oshkosh Chamber, and this is our second session of our virtual um, webinar, not webinars. I guess these are town hall sessions. We're featuring local elected officials and other government officials over the next several weeks. Last week we had U.S. Senator Ron Johnson join us. This week we have Assembly Representative from Oshkosh, Gordon Hintz, and also Minority Leader of the Assembly down at the state legislature. So we've been you've been a representative for a number of years here, and you're becoming a fixture here.
Well, I don't know what I think of the word fixture, but I have been in office for a while. You go from being new to old pretty quick.
Yeah. Hey, being a fixture these days ain't so bad. So
I was gonna say, have we hit 30 a year, 30 years for you yet?
I'm going to be hitting 34 years on November 30th. So that's
I remember the 25th anniversary, or
that was this was supposed to be a 2.5 year, 3 year gig, and then I go on to something else. But I got nowhere else to go apparently. So, but anyways, thanks Gordon for joining us. We are recording this session, and then it'll be on our website, and people will be able to go back to it. And, we get a lot of views after the fact, so it's always a good thing. Format is going to be what we usually been doing. We'll allow our guests to provide some update, talk about priorities and things that you're working on, and then we'll follow it up with questions from those viewing. And so if anybody has a question, use the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring those, and then we'll ask those questions at the end. So with that, Gordon, we're going to throw it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John, and to the Oshkosh Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity, and thank you all who are joining us. I'm going to do my best to kind of give an update on what's been happening in Wisconsin, what's coming up, both policy-wise and politically, and then just some of the challenges that the area, state, nation, world, I guess, are facing, and some of the different impacts on that. But I certainly look forward to questions or points that need to be made. I always say that, democracy is not a spectator sport, and we need engagement, not just at election time, but I'm able to do my job better when I have input and opportunities like this. So with that, we are in October of our session that goes through as late as April. And the biggest thing that we do every 2 years is the 2-year budget that was passed and signed into law on time. That runs from July 1st of this year to June 30th of 2023. And I'll get into the budget shortly to talk about some of the points, because as we are dealing with the I don't know what phase of the pandemic that we're in, but the state has actually been in pretty good shape, better shape than I thought it would be in. But I'll get into the budget in a second. The first thing I just wanted to touch on, a couple of things that are before us now that might be pertinent to a lot of the members and small businesses that we have in the community. For a number of years, there has been a push to fully repeal the personal property tax. Doing so has had support from all sides. The biggest obstacle in past years was how do we address the lost revenue for municipalities, which, as you know, are limited, both by levy limits on property taxes, but have few revenue options compared to a lot of other states. This also was an issue related to TIFs that had a disproportionate amount of personal property. So I know, for instance, in Plymouth, I think, where they had Sargento, they had done a TIF where a lot of the valuation was created because of the personal property that was a part of that. That being said, if we could make up for the revenue lost to municipalities to make them whole, and make sure that that commitment stays, that we don't just offer it for 2 years and pull it away and have a property tax shift to everybody else. I think that was something that folks could agree on. There was finally, I think, support to get it done But it's complicated. Again, one of the goals was to make municipalities whole. The other goal was to make sure that we have some certainty on what the actual cost is going to be when people utilize it. There was a proposal that passed the legislature that Governor Evers vetoed, that I voted against because we couldn't get all of the accountability provisions in there that repealed the property tax, personal property tax for small businesses, and allowed for the funding for local government. We reintroduced the proposal that closed a lot of the loopholes that were included in there. Part of the challenge was there were some out-of-state companies who were, without closing the loopholes, could have exploited the personal property tax to take advantage of other tax benefits that the state have, like the man and ag tax credit, that would create both uncertainty and the potential to cost more than what the estimated cost of the personal property tax repeal would be. I know that the grocers and maybe the Restaurants Association are meeting with the Department of Revenue sometime in this week to try to iron some things out. And I think it would be a shame if we couldn't get, bipartisan support. There's definitely been some finger pointing and some accusations of intent between the bill's passage, and maybe some wanted a more expansive PPT repeal and what the governor did. But I know I've heard from the chamber and others on it. I'd really like us to do it, and we certainly have time now, but without some action before the end of the year, I think it's going to be harder to get it done next year. And it would be a shame. We're in good fiscal shape as a state to be able to repeal it and offset that lost revenue. We know that there's been workforce housing issues around the state. And in just about every community, and we're a lot of discussions here, especially with some new housing development projects about the need for affordable housing for workers, in combination with some of the higher end housing that I think we're trying to do. There's been some recent bills introduced that I haven't totally vetted by some colleagues. I know the Counties Association is weighing in on some of those. There's not a magic wand here, like a lot of other housing projects for, the elderly, other types of properties. The state tries to remove some barriers, tries to incentivize the construction. And so, I know just looking at a couple of bills, looking for a way to establish procedures to expedite permits for shovel-ready projects. In other words, removing some of the time that might be involved, although I think we all recognize that a lot of the delay for any kind of project right now is supplies, available contractors, and things. Some of it tries to target some of the use of ARPA money to help better connect workforce housing infrastructure like water and sewer, as well as establishing a loan program for rehab or older workforce housing. Again, a lot of these just got introduced in the last 2 weeks, but I think it is going to be a priority by a lot of folks in the majority to try to get hearings and pass some things that may help make it easier to try to prioritize it. I mean, I know that with a lot of the challenges right now, some of them government can do something about. A lot of them government can help steer. And again, we just, if we're the obstacle, I think we'd like to try to get, out of the way. So stay tuned as those things get out there. But a lot of the efforts are seemingly, there's a number of bills that came out as part of a package that are aimed at trying to incentivize, encourage, remove barriers. I think there's some tax exemptions from the, it was this one. Part of the reason is the county's opposed to it because it involves the county, not our county, the ones that have a sales tax. Just going back to the budget, and part of this is just how I ordered things. As I mentioned, we have a 2-year budget. In March of 20, when COVID hit, and we, one of my big fears, having been in office during the Great Recession, was, the bottom falling out, with people not working, with businesses and sales and other things collapsing. that we would see significant loss of revenue. And one of the challenges that we have during a recession is there tends to be more demand for government services, unemployment, other type of income supports, more crime. And of course, we have less revenue, fewer dollars to be able to cover those things. If you had asked me in April of 2020, what kind of deficit we were going to face, I think we were all, pretty concerned. I think what we saw was the economy overall, and specifically Wisconsin's economy, was more resilient than we expected. Businesses were innovative, steadfast. I think what we saw was really a disproportionate hit where, kind of 20% of industry sectors were hit, especially in the service sector and retail and hospitality. And for a lot of them, now they're getting hit with the labor shortage and inflation. And I think we're going to see some continued contraction there. That being said, our revenues held up and then some. When we do a budget, we have, here is what things would cost that we do now in the next 2 years. In other words, if we did just what we did the last 2 years, here's what the expenses would be with inflation, with other considerations. And then we look at what expected revenues would be. And we get pretty documented economic forecasts, sort of at the micro level from the breakfasts that we have with Brian in the chamber, kind of forecasting what the next few years would look like, but they're pretty conservative estimates. I mean, about 80% of the state's revenue is from income tax, sales tax, and corporate income tax. And those all stayed pretty resolute, especially corporate, on maintaining our state revenues. And then obviously, we've had both under President Trump and President Biden significant stimuluses, which I think definitely help offset, if not, stimulated the economy in a lot of ways. I guess one of my concerns would be, going forward as these kind of things run out and we have some of the existing challenges with supply chain and inflation, some red flags about, some of the, when the money runs out, what ultimately happens. But we stayed afloat. Revenues came in. The state had actually more money than it thought it was going to have. A lot of the federal money through ARPA and through the CARES Act for schools was really prioritized as one-time money. And you should spend one-time money on one-time expenses. I know the city and the county are kind of working through their ARPA money to try to invest in things that, help build back better, like President Biden says, but also have some nexus to the needs of managing things during the pandemic. There wasn't anything that I would say would be horrible in the budget, meaning I think it was drafted as something that Governor Evers could sign, which he did. I think having some certainty and having a budget on time was a priority. So he was in a different position. But it was disappointed given that the state now has a little more than $2.5 billion in its fund balance, as well as, we made good progress on increasing the rainy day fund, something the state's always had historically forever been challenged with, and there's more money than ever in there. But with that much in the balance, the idea that we could put almost no new money into classrooms, the money that went into K-12 primarily went into buying down property taxes, which is a good thing. But there's a lot of increased need in classrooms right now because of COVID. And while they've invested some of the resources they've had, a lot of it's already been spent. Some of it's gone into those one-time things. But we had the resources to continue to address, mental health concerns, increase funding for special ed, more so districts aren't having to cost shift. And again, we spent about 20% of the new money that Governor Walker put into K-12 education in his final budget. So some of this seemed aimed more at perhaps undermining the education governor than doing what's ultimately right for the state. We've had superintendents say that within the next year, they'll be looking at layoffs, and school districts will probably be faced with the choice of going to referendum. And that seems crazy at a time when the state revenues are in pretty good shape. And even an inflationary increase or a little more would have gone a long ways to addressing some of the challenges that we have. And we know that the labor issue is hitting districts as well. I'd say the same thing about local government. There's a lot of talk about making sure that we fund public safety, and about 60% of City of Oshkosh's budget goes to public safety. And there was a push to try to both get an increase in shared revenue as well as give more revenue options to communities like Oshkosh, passed by referendum. And those things were included in the budget. Those things were taken out. So there's no new money for local communities. And I think this has gone on for a while, and too long, quite frankly. We have seen communities be innovative. Of course, we've also seen communities nickel and dime us increasingly with fees to cover the lack of revenue options available to them. I think that we need to look at things like, look, I always tell people that run for city council, I want my garbage picked up. I want the police to come when I call, and I want the snow plowed. Before you do anything else, do those well. And I think we're really fortunate to have those good services here in Oshkosh and through communities throughout the state. But as we all know, quality of life is a big issue. To be able to do some more things locally for economic development, I think would help enhance things, and communities are really limited. Even, Milwaukee, of all the communities, I think 500,000 and over has the fewest revenue options of any community its size in the country. Milwaukee's got a lot of problems, but one of them is the inability to be able to manage what it feels they need in terms of resources. So I think it was a missed opportunity on that. And the last one I'll say was the UW system. Again, there was some federal money there. And even if they can use some of it for ongoing expenses, that just means in 2 years there's a hole. The federal money goes away, and it's going to take, to fund it at an inflationary level, you'd have to fund it, what this increase would have been and what the increase would need to be in 2 years. And so that's going to suck up a lot of the fund balance that's there. And it's going to be a little deceptive, I think, to decision makers at the time. I was hopeful in talking to Governor Thompson that he would really make some headway. Wisconsin's one of 11 states that cut funding for the UW system during the longest economic expansion in U.S. history, that we saw, through most of the last decade. And that's, a real missed opportunity. Like local governments, I think UW system and UW Oshkosh have been creative, have maintained trying to provide value to our students and their families, and also provide educated workforce going forward. But it wasn't built overnight. It doesn't fall apart overnight. And the idea that we had $2.5 billion and still have it sitting in an account, and we could only pass another $8 million for an entire UW system, given what was proposed by the regents, introduced by Governor Evers, and advocated by former Governor Thompson, I think left a lot to be desired. Again, we had the resources for the budget to be able to pass an income tax cut, to buy down the property tax, to fund K-12, to increase funding for UW system, and to provide shared revenue funding, and still have a fund balance. And so I think it's a kind of a missed opportunity. A lot of the Wisconsin Policy Forum really looked at the revenue position we were in, some of the federal one-time investment money coming in, and thought this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the trajectory of the state. And I just worry that, the majority squandered it in this case. I will say one of the things, I was on the building commission in 2013 through 2013 when there were 4 UW system projects in the state, and one of them was the Clough Hall renovation for both the nursing and education school, UW Oshkosh. There were 4 statewide projects, I think at maybe Parkside, La Crosse, and Superior, and there was really only money to do 2 of them. So what we did at the time was we phased Clough Hall 1 and got the first part done. And really since then I've been advocating for the second part of funding. Some of it, when I was on finance, kind of got rejected because of the cloud of the foundation issue. But Representative Schra, Senator Fine, and myself really pushed, and I'm grateful that those guys helped get it over the finish line. Included in the budget, it was the fourth biggest priority. Chancellor Levitt's been tireless on this one, and later today, so it was included in the budget. I forget what it was, like a $25 million, I think, renovation, and this is for the education school. And if you go there now, and I've toured it several times, it's about as outdated as the most outdated classroom. And if you think about what we just went through with COVID, where there was so much emphasis on remote learning, on virtual learning, we need teachers that are being trained and educated in classrooms that reflect where they're ultimately going to be teaching. And so a lot of that work on the interior is going to be hooking it up with the kind of modern infrastructure that's going to be what the future of education looks like. Remember, this was the teachers' college, and while we've struggled with some enrollment issues, having a learning environment like this will be a big deal. And I think they are going to approve it later today. That was one of my big pushes, is unlike a lot of projects that come before the state, this one was ready to go. Sometimes we pass money for capital budget for projects that may not have a shovel in the ground for 3 years, and I think that's kind of a waste. This one's ready to go, and kudos to UW Oshkosh leadership for moving it forward. Just so you guys know, I mean, these things are sort of the state author, enumerates or puts dollars for a project. Let's say it's 25 million. When the project comes due, it authorizes that the state has the ability to issue bonds for that amount. And a couple times a year they go and when rates are favorable, and kind of manage the state's finances and debt in that way. And so, that's ultimately what it means, but this is going to get the green light later today. Mentioned the state's in good shape. The big issue that's facing all of you, and probably get some questions on this, and I know, I think, for years, I went back into a folder that I had in my office that was talking about the workforce shortage, and it was in 2013, and looking at some of the future forecasting for the state. In fact, the figure that I'm using maybe is, it's 5 years old, but we're the 13th oldest state in the country. And we are seeing a people shortage, a labor shortage, a specific industry shortage, and everybody is impacted in different ways. And it seems to have been accelerated perhaps with COVID and some of the other changes that are happening with the workforce. And then some of that's impacting inflation and the supply chain. And the questions are, what are the things that the state, the states can do? And I think we need to collectively, and that involves the business community and others in the state, New North regionally, because I think some of the challenges are going to be different, is, what are the things that we can do in the short term? Because the problem is probably going to continue to get worse. And what are some of the planning decisions that we can make to consider for the long term? Because, in the states, from a state perspective, with an aging population, not unlike what I said with the recession, when you have more people retiring, more people, a lot of people don't pay taxes on Social Security and their retirement income. So we generate less revenue, the more of the population that's retired, but we also have increased demand for services, Medicaid for long-term care and frail elderly. And so we're going to have fewer resources and more expenses at the same time that we need to be able to maintain core services. We already have a correction officer shortage, and we're kind of going to be faced with the challenge of, if we are going to adequately staff our prisons in the state, we're going to need to pay a lot more if that's how the market's going to work, or we're going to need to look at being more creative at some of our diversion programs, keeping some nonviolent offenders with bracelets or with probation and parole, so we can manage them at a lower cost, hopefully reduce recidivism, and be able to consider what, staffing issues. So those are some of the things that we also, look at. I think, I know that there was a lot of emphasis on, we need every worker possible, and I'm not going to tell a business if they knew someone who was sitting out because of the benefit that that wasn't real, but overall, and we'll get numbers tomorrow that I think will show not a significant jump in the workforce for when those benefits expired. But we do need to look at the prison issue, expungement for records for people, under 25 that had an offense, so that they're going to be able to get back into the workforce and be productive. There was a decision made years ago aimed at public employees that said, you can't double dip. When you retire, you can't then come back on, as a teacher and get your benefits. Well, the problem with that is we have a shortage right now, and the best type of long-term employees or substitutes in that are teachers who know what they're doing and who are educated. So in that field, I think that removing some of those barriers for people to be able to work and maximize the workforce are the kind of things that we can do. At the WMC panel I was on last week, there was a question specifically to what the state can do to remove barriers, or to try to increase the number of commercial driver's license people, because we're seeing a negative impact on distribution systems given how much manufacturing and production is here, and the problems with getting those goods to market, just because of the transportation problem and bottleneck that we have. Over the years, we have done some things to try to make it easier, for instance, for active military folks that return back that have had some experience with big level transportation. And I think we need to continue to do that. I think part of the challenge is we don't want to water down the standards. I met with some math teachers the other day that were highlighting at the university level the shortage of math teachers. That's kind of what we're seeing, especially in education, is really a shortage of math and science teachers, which are some of the most important ones we can have for our kids' education. And it's not totally surprising, because if you're a great mathematician or a great scientist, you might go on to be an engineer. You may not want to go into the education field unless you're a teacher, but it's having a real impact on the future of our kids, given what we want them to ultimately be able to be when they graduate from our schools, and what the needs are employment wise in our state. I will say that, and so we were looking at those kind of, considerations, and some of it, I think, going forward from an industry standpoint is going to be being innovative. Is going to be trying to, how do we prioritize what are the most important industries? It would seem like CDL is a big one that's of immediate concern. I think the math one is a big concern, and I know what I was going to say. We've had we made it so we reduced the requirement to be able to teach math in high school. So there are some people that are licensed between 4th grade and 12th grade. And of course, for some smaller districts that may not have the resources, that may pay lower, that's allowed them to fill the spot. But I think we would prefer that not have just someone filling the spot, but someone who has the ability to really invest long-term. And so I look forward to kind of questions and input from folks. Just breezing through the federal stuff. I mean, a lot of the big things that are going to happen are still going to be from a lot of the federal money that's come to the state that's for specific things. And a lot of it was for beyond COVID. And then there's the hopes that we can get some sort of infrastructure bill in our state, in talking both to energy utilities, renewable energy folks, electric vehicles, which seem to be accelerating, and transportation folks. This is sort of the once in a generational opportunity. Although there's concerns about our capacity to be able to manage that given all the other factors that are happening, but that's something as a state, given that it's going to flow down to the states, that we're certainly looking forward to. Let's skip some of these other things. I mean, there's plenty of other things that I think I'll pivot a little bit into the lay of the land. I don't think anybody would be surprised if I say that the state of politics in the state and country leave a lot to be desired. And, with the midterm election where the governor is up for re-election, where, the last election, it was just the presidential campaign. We had no other statewide races. Every 12 years we have that in Wisconsin, but you had Senator Johnson on last week. There's going to be a lot of attention on that race. Governor and attorney general. are up for reelection. And there's always things that kind of, especially gamesmanship, that usually happen later. But the way it should work is let's govern and try to get the things done that need to get done, and we'll disagree on the things we can't get done, and that'll give the people a choice in the fall. Increasingly, we're meeting fewer days, we're passing fewer bills, we're signing fewer laws, and even on things that had support, like juvenile justice reform that we got Governor Walker to sign, there's little interest. They don't want Governor Evers to have success or that much to run on, and it is a dysfunctional relationship. But it also seems to be where the intent is based more on politics than than on policy, and maybe that's part of some of the national picture as well. Electorally, in the next few weeks, we may very well be taking up legislative maps. I know there's been a lot of attention on this. Every 10 years with the census data, the legislature is required to draw legislative districts. As someone who's been on the other end for the last decade, the Wisconsin's gerrymandering went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court after a federal court ruled that it was unconstitutional. We don't have very many competitive districts, and I can tell you that everything that you hate about politics is usually a result of having districts drawn the way they are, where you have a handful of districts that are 80% Democrat, and a number more districts that are 65 and above Republican, leaving very few people in the middle. I get to be in the middle, but there's not enough. There's only 2 districts, I think, that were decided by 5 points or less. And the software that we have to redraw districts is incredible. I mean, I played with the mapping. I can draw districts that are great for Democrats, that will determine the outcome of elections, over the next 10 years. I'm not hopeful, but it'd be nice if we could get maps that were drawn to be more reflective of the state. The governor's had a People's Maps Commission that doesn't involve the governor or any politicians, but people putting it together, and I think they're going to release maps that has been centered around a process. But we expect the Republicans to introduce maps in the near future. The expected course is that will get passed, and then the governor will probably veto them if they're gerrymandered. And then it'll go to the courts to decide what changes need to be made, and what those maps look like. But the reason I said that it's everything you hate about politics is sometimes we'll have, if you remember, like when Governor Evers got elected, before he was even sworn in, the legislature met to take away some of his powers that the public had just elected him to make. And he, when I would talk to my colleagues, they were like, well, I don't want to vote for this, but I'll lose my seat if I don't, because I'll get primaried, right? In other words, there was no chance they would lose their seat in the general election, but then they would lose it because someone to the right would be running against them. And of course, when I have an 80% Dem seat and I'm trying to get one of my liberal colleagues to be a little more reasonable, they'll be like, well, someone from the left might be running, to the left. And so I've got to, keep my guard up. And so it distorts the decision-making process, and it incentivizes bad decision-making. And it means that the state is, the decision makers are out of touch with where the public is ultimately. Last thing I will touch upon is, because I think it's really dangerous, but you've all been following sort of the big lie, and it's happening in a number of states. And the intent, I mean, there was so much preparation done after 2016, and they weren't successful, but there was a lot of attempts to hack from foreign influences, and those things weren't successful. But between foreign interference and COVID, as the Trump administration, was it Homeland Security, ultimately indicated it was the most secure election that we've had. The push to kind of get people to doubt the integrity of our elections is aimed more at making it easier to change laws. A number of states like Texas are pushing initiatives that would allow the legislature to pass a law that would put the independent legislature doctrine that would allow legislators to overturn the results of the election if they felt that there was any impropriety, which again, now, the investigation is saying if you don't, it's on the clerks to prove that there wasn't fraud, In other words, instead of, finding that there was fraud, and we've had audits in Dane County and Milwaukee County, nothing. Even those that are in Arizona haven't necessarily found anything, but there's this continued idea that if we make it so that enough people distrust the elections and are illegitimate, it'll lay the groundwork for conservative legislators to be able to overturn the results of the election, which is what we're finding out was sort of the intent of a lot of the push from folks that attacked our country on January 6th. I know that former Lieutenant Governor Kleefisch was asked if she would support allowing the legislature to overturn the results of the election, and she said she wasn't sure. She hadn't heard about that proposal. This is something that's going to be coming up, and even if you're the most conservative guy in the world, I really don't think that we should enable legislatures to be able to overturn the will of the public based on what their subjective feelings are. And that's increasingly becoming tense because we're actually talking about sort of the institution of democracy. And with that, again, I have no idea how much time I just rambled for, but I'm happy to take questions.
Perfect. Thanks. Anybody who has questions, please submit those using the Q&A tab. One quick item. You mentioned not a lot of laws were passed in the past session for a variety of different reasons. Now coming up into the next session, it's an election year, so it's usually shortened up. So what do you see on the horizon in terms of your caucus and their legislative priorities in the upcoming session?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in the minority, and certainly there's a lot of things that Governor Evers has proposed that, we ultimately would like to see done. My real emphasis since the budget has been, because we actually found out we have more money, we got a revenue update, would be to revisit some of those decisions to provide additional resources for schools, cities, and universities, just because the governor made one veto that returned considerable money out of a pot that the Joint Finance Committee would have back into the fund balance. And I think that would put us in a position to do it. But, Democrats are, there's things that we, would like to ultimately see happen. I've mentioned expungement, which we had passed in the Assembly and we're trying to get passed in the state Senate. That again would eliminate the criminal records from folks, I believe, under 25. So we didn't put a stigma, eligible. So we didn't have a stigma on their ability to work or be disqualified for certain jobs. But we're seeing childcare being a continued huge issue. We know a lot of private employers provide paid leave as a way of recruitment and retainment. We do have a paid leave bill. That's not funded or mandated on the employer, but that is a vehicle to allow employees to be able to pay in, that we would like to ultimately get, a hearing on. We've got bills that are trying to be aimed at economic security to try to incentivize folks that don't have a secure retirement or pension plan, to be able to buy in. And some of those came out of a task force that the governor ultimately did. We still support, although it's not going to happen, expanding Badger Care as much for a budget reason as a healthcare reason. This is one that, I think we're down to 11 states left in the country. Red states, blue states, all of our neighboring states have taken the Medicaid expansion. I think we've beaten that one to death, but I don't think that we're going to be, I'm resigned to the fact that under the current makeup, that just doesn't seem like it's going to be happening. Redistricting is going to be what the big focus is on right now, until it ultimately goes to the courts. We have pushed for a independent process, and just for the record, I was supportive of the independent process while I was in the majority, so it was not some sort of sour grapes. And on the other side of the, trying to strengthen public trust in our elections, do the opposite, implement automatic voter registration, look at closing some of the loopholes in our campaign finance system, universal background checks, the fact that violent felons can still buy firearms at gun shows without a background check seems to be an oversight that I think most people, including gun owners, would ultimately support, but it kind of gets wrapped up in this big issue. I think the big one that's been disappointing is, again, and Representative Schrod deserves a lot of credit. He worked with Representative Goyke. A lot of you have heard Lincoln Hills in the press, and that is the school for juvenile youth that commit crimes, that are incarcerated. And the outcomes have been terrible. There have been some criminal, behavior and problems there, both with staff and workers. And we kind of have a permanent failed system. And we looked at states, and I think Missouri was kind of one of the models to have create a better system. And it was one of the best days that we had during the Walker administration, in that the legislature passed it, and he signed it into law. But it was going to take, 2 or 3 budgets to be able to do it. It was trying to empower counties to be able to get in on building regional facilities so that troubled youth could be closer to home, make sure that we're staffing those with enough educators and mental health professionals to have the kind of intervention that was necessary. And it was so hopeful when we passed it. And in talking to the representatives involved, they just said, I remember Senator Fitzgerald just said, well, it's Tony Evers' problem now. The change in governors, made it that they weren't interested in doing it. And I think, the public really needs to expect better than that, and understand that whether it's a workforce issue, a public safety issue, or an outcomes issue, we need to, continue to work on that over time. We can't, we're not going to be able to fix or eliminate or reduce our prison population overnight. But in a lot of conservative states like Texas, Kansas, there's been sort of the uniting of the fiscal conservatives and the moral left who, want to reduce their prison populations, reinvest in the public, and keep people safe. And that's just one thing that we've struggled here. And with the one area that we did get action, it didn't happen. So those are the kind of things that we're continuing to advocate.
You talked about corrections, and we have a significant sized correctional facility here in Oshkosh. Pre-COVID, we've had some discussion with some of the officials at the correctional institution about because of the labor shortage and the tightness of the labor shortage, is there some ways that we can work together with employers to train up some of the soon to be released back into their communities, folks over there. And the thing that kind of put a wrinkle into that is the policy in terms of corrections. As somebody gets released back into the community, they have to be released back into their home community. And probably in some cases, that's probably the worst thing that could happen for an inmate. So are there some opportunities and where, we could, you talked about barriers before. Is that a potential barrier that we could eliminate to, to help create some opportunities for more people to, come into the workplace here in Oshkosh and the region?
I think that's something worth looking at. I mentioned, some of the stuff that we're going to be looking at is going to be long-term. Some of it's going to be about trying to make our state as desirable as possible, looking at how do we incentivize people to move here. But in the immediate is how do we maximize that people are here? And I think you're thinking along the right lines. And we know that, shelter and employment are, the 2 ingredients to stability for someone that's getting out of prison. So they're able to, stay out of trouble and make ends meet. And we also know that prisons, that having a record is an obstacle for a lot of opportunities. And of course, if their only options are something that is less fulfilling or underpaid, that may go back into a life of crime if that is more, desirable. I think we'll have to, look at some of those things. I can tell you that because we don't have unlimited resources, when we have looked at, what is done as in the ramping up to get someone released, they kind of identify what the release dates are, and they look at, in the months and weeks beforehand, what they can do to get ready for someone's transition out to make it more successful. And, and it is about, do you have anybody on the outside? Do you have, shelter? We've had some issues with transitional housing here, but I think, and I'm happy to look into it. One of the questions would be, would it be at the scale to make a difference? But I think we need to think along those lines.
Question that came in is, when will the jurisdictional lines be drawn and finalized?
Yeah, great question. So it's my first time really through it where we passed maps, but it was, single party control, and it went pretty quick in 2011. As I believe that we will be taking up maps before November 10th, which I think may be one of the last days we meet this year as a full legislature, committees and meets for session. I think, maps will be introduced sometime in the next 2 weeks, or could be. If not, it will be January, but they'll have to have probably a joint hearing on those maps. And, it may, if they want to move it pretty quick, we'll have to kind of make, considerations of that. I think if it is drawn pretty fairly with even shapes and not splitting up communities and not, rigging it. Again, the public should choose their politicians, not the other way around. And I can tell you, as someone who has played with the technology, it's incredible what you can do. You can pretty much pick your voters. But if it isn't, the governor will probably veto it, and then it will go to the courts. There's been questions about the state or federal courts. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court just asked because we've had sort of these preemptive lawsuits. The Republican side would like to use the conditions that maps should be drawn on to keep them as close to the existing maps as possible, which makes sense if you want to have control over the legislature. That is a different criteria than was used in 2010 or 2011 when they switched several 100,000 people from one district to a different district. So one of the criteria is, if the maps get vetoed and go to courts, will be what should the court take into consideration as, as they're considering maps and perhaps drawing maps, for the legislature to use. Usually in states, and Wisconsin's history until 2011, there has been divided government. So in 2001, 1991, 1981, maps were ultimately made it to the courts, and I think were drawn in a way to, be as fair as possible. But where you start matters. So if they decide that they want to make tweaks, but that they want to keep them as close to possible, there's already sort of a built-in bias. But it's later than normal because the census data was delayed. We would normally have it done by now. One of my fears is that the maps get passed late, and then it goes through an arduous court process. And, as someone whose other hat is to recruit candidates to run for office, if you don't know what your district looks like or what district you're in, that's a problem. So timing matters, and I just hope that we can, again, everybody that's frustrated with politics should support having, fair maps. There are demographic outcomes that you're going to have more liberal, more conservative places. Everybody's kind of aware of the urban rural divide right now. But like I said, we drew a map the other day, and I can make it a majority Democratic seats if I want to, but I don't want to. I'd rather have it be based on drawing it, fairly.
There must be some drop dead date there, though, right?
I think the court said by March, which is late. But I believe they said if things couldn't be resolved, they would be drawing the maps. And every week something different starts to happen. And again, before we've even had maps, you had lawsuits on both sides. But I thought it was interesting that the Wisconsin State Supreme Court asked both parties litigants to put forward what criteria they believe is important to be used. So you're already kind of having so they can consider the arguments for what the priorities should be used for consideration of what maps happen. Even if the later it goes, candidates take out papers April 15th, and you have till June 1st to get on the ballot for November. So it definitely is accelerated, and it certainly impacts both incumbents and challengers.
Great. Well, we're nearing our time limit, so I would again thank you for joining us. A couple comments. Like to hear. I heard the good news last week, and saw that there's some movement on the personal property tax front. There's a lot of things you have to work through, which is important. But one thing to consider, a small operation like the chamber, we hire our CPA firm to fill out the forms for that personal property tax, and it's a complicated form, but we pay $800 for that service, and we pay $500 in personal property tax every year. So the balance on that is kind of goofy.
If you and I were starting over and coming up with a state and figuring out how to pay for things, we would never create a tax like this. It is just contrary to, it's just, and it is. I mean, when I talk to small businesses with, 1, 2, 3 employees, so much of it is, not only is it a cost, but the administrative cost of it is, and the unfairness of it is absurd.
Yeah. Well, one last thing, sometimes we don't thank you enough, but we appreciate your work on the building commission and bringing those dollars back in support of the Clover renovation on UWO campus. I know the university, Chancellor Levitt worked hard in terms of advancing that, and needed support certainly to get it over the finish line. So we do appreciate your work on that. So thank you very much on that.
Thank you. And you've got great members, and people of all stripes are very good at informing me, keep me engaged, and helping me understand the issues they face.
Yeah, great. Again, this is going to be it has been recorded. It'll be on our website sometime this afternoon, so you can go back to it and view it again, review it for the first time. Next week we are tag teaming it with City Manager Mark Roloff and our County Executive John Damel. I'm sure they'll be talking about their upcoming budgets and other issues that are facing both the city and the county. So please plan on joining us at the same time next week. So again, on behalf of the chamber, Gordon, thank you very much for joining us, and we will hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.